The autumn wind in the city did not just blow, it bit. It carried the scent of wet asphalt, exhaust fumes, and the cold, metallic indifference of a relentless American metropolis. Outside, the neon signs of skyscrapers flickered through the heavy drizzle, casting long, distorted shadows onto the pavement. Inside the municipal shelter, the air was different, thick, sterile, and heavy with the collective sighs of 100 displaced souls. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a low, maddening drone, illuminating rows of plastic chairs and the stained linoleum floor. She sat near the back, away from the intake desk where the desperate gathered in shifting lines. At over 70 years old, her posture was slightly bent, a testament to the decades of heavy lifting, long shifts, and quiet hardships that had defined her existence. Yet, there was an unspoken dignity in the way she carried herself. Her hands, resting in her lap, were heavily calloused and mapped with deep lines of a lifetime of labor. Those hands now tightly clutched a single, faded canvas bag. It was light, shockingly so, containing the remaining fragments of her entire life. A few changes of clothes, a cracked plastic comb, and a water-damaged photograph of a family long since scattered to the wind. A recent, devastating eviction had stripped her of her apartment, a cramped third-floor walk-up she had called home for 20 years. The landlord had raised the rent beyond the reach of her meager Social Security checks, and just like that, she was cast into the system. Most people her age would have broken under the weight of such sudden displacement. But her spirit remained resilient, a quiet flame burning beneath a weathered exterior. She did not weep, nor did she complain. She simply waited, surviving 1 hour at a time. The heavy security doors at the front of the shelter hissed open, letting in a swirl of damp, freezing air. A young man stepped inside, looking entirely out of place in a crisp navy suit and a damp wool overcoat. He clutched a leather briefcase to his chest, like a shield against the misery of the room. He was a pro bono legal aid representative, his eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of determination and exhaustion. When his gaze finally landed on her, he checked a piece of paper in his hand, took a deep breath, and walked over. He asked if he could sit. She nodded quietly, shifting her canvas bag closer to her boots. When he spoke, his voice carried an absurd, almost mocking revelation that felt entirely surreal given their surroundings. He explained that he had spent 3 weeks tracking her down through the city's labyrinthine social services network, an eccentric, long-forgotten distant relative, a man she barely remembered from a handful of childhood stories, had passed away in rural New England. In his final testament, he had bypassed his immediate estranged offspring and left his entire estate to her. She listened in silence, her expression unreadable. It sounded like a cruel joke, a mirage meant to taunt someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. But then came the catch, the bizarre clause that made the young lawyer shake his head in disbelief. Due to decades of accumulating back taxes, administrative liens, and the strict, paranoid stipulations written into the old man's will, the estate could not simply be inherited. To prevent the county from seizing the property immediately, the rightful heir had to formally purchase the deed from the estate's executors. The price dictated by the dead man's decree was exact, unyielding, and absurdly small. Exactly $5. It had to be paid in cash, on the spot, to execute the transfer before the midnight deadline tonight. The lawyer leaned in, his eyes searching hers, waiting for a reaction. For a long moment, the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to grow louder, drowning out the murmurs of the shelter. She looked down at her calloused hands, then unzipped the small front pocket of her canvas bag. Her fingers brushed past the useless receipts and the old photograph, finally settling on a single, crumpled $5 bill, the absolute last of her physical currency. She pulled it out, smoothing the wrinkled paper against her knee with a slow, deliberate motion. She looked back up at him, her eyes clear and resolute, and handed over the bill. The overnight Greyhound bus dropped her off at a deserted crossroads, just as the gray dawn was breaking over the hills of rural New England. The air here did not taste of exhaust and asphalt. It was sharp, biting, and thick with the scent of pine and coming winter. She walked the final mile to the small town's municipal building, her boots crunching softly against the frosty earth. Inside the wood-paneled office of the county clerk, She finalized the paperwork. The transaction felt surreal as she watched the official stamp the deed, formally recognizing her as the sole owner of the property. She left the building with nothing but her canvas bag and a heavy iron key that felt ice cold against her palm. The gravel road leading to her new domain was less of a road and more of a forgotten scar through the woods. Overgrown weeds, hardened by the frost, clawed at her ankles as she walked. Branches from untamed oak and maple trees arched overhead, blotting out much of the pale autumn sky. At the end of that desolate path sat the farmhouse. Built in the late 19th century, it stood as a weather-beaten monument to absolute decay. The structure sagged beneath the weight of 100 harsh winters, its once white paint peeled away to reveal splintered, graying wood. The front porch groaned under a heavy accumulation of rotting leaves, its pillars tilting at a precarious angle. Thick, choking blankets of English ivy climbed the facade, wrapping around the boarded-up windows like skeletal fingers trying to drag the house into the earth. To anyone else, the property would have looked like a hazardous ruin, a worthless pile of timber fit only for a bulldozer. But as she stood at the edge of the clearing, her gaze did not linger on the rotting porch or the missing roof shingles. She looked at the chimney, still standing straight and true, and the solid stone foundation anchoring the house to the dirt. For the first time in months, the heavy, suffocating knot of anxiety in her chest began to loosen. This place was broken, yes, but it was hers. No landlord could knock on this door, no legal notice could strip it away. It was a $5 sanctuary, purchased with her very last bill, and it belonged entirely to her. She ascended the creaking steps carefully, her weight testing each board before she fully committed her stride. The heavy oak front door resisted at first, swollen from decades of dampness, but with a firm push from her calloused shoulder, the old lock gave way with a loud, echoing click. Stepping across the threshold, she was greeted by an immediate, profound silence. The interior air was heavy, stagnant, and thick with the dust of half a century. It carried the distinct, melancholic scent of aged cedar, dry rot, and decaying paper. Pale shafts of light pierced through the cracks in the window boards, illuminating millions of dust motes dancing in the stillness. Abandoned furniture sat like ghosts under yellowed sheets, and the wallpaper hung in long, brittle ribbons from the plaster. Yet, there was an underlying warmth to the structure, a lingering memory of the lives that had once flourished within these walls before time forgot them. She did not set her canvas bag down immediately. Instead, she walked through the ground floor, her footsteps waking the sleeping house with deep, hollow echoes. She checked the sturdiness of the floors and the integrity of the ceilings. Satisfied that the roof above the kitchen was intact, she finally placed her single possession on a sturdy wooden table. As the pale afternoon light quickly waned, darkness began to pool in the corners of the cavernous rooms. The temperature inside dropped rapidly, matching the freezing air of the New England night outside. The wind began to howl, rattling the loose boards of the exterior, but the thick walls held the chill at bay. From the depths of her canvas bag, she pulled a small, thick candle, a remnant she had salvaged from her final days in the city, and a single box of matches. Striking the match, the sharp scent of sulfur momentarily cut through the smell of dust. She touched the flame to the wick. A small, golden pocket of light bloomed in the center of the dark kitchen, casting long, dancing shadows across the ancient walls. She pulled a wooden chair close to the flame and sat down. The light was fragile, and the house was vast and ruined, but as she watched the steady burn of the wick, she knew she had found her footing. She had claimed her sanctuary. The first week of her solitary survival in the farmhouse was not measured by the ticking of a clock, but by the slow, predictable arc of the pale winter sun across the floorboards. Survival, she had learned long ago in the cold corners of the city, was a matter of routine. She rose with the first light, when the air inside the house was so cold her breath formed thick white plumes in the dark. Her bones ached from the dampness, but she refused to let the physical toll of her 70 years slow her down. There was an immense, grounding purpose in having a space of her own to tend to, and she set about her tasks with the quiet discipline of a monk. She began cleaning the farmhouse room by room, armed with nothing but an old broom she had found in the root cellar, a bucket of melted snow, and rags torn from her own sparse belongings. It was grueling, meticulous work. She swept away thick, velvety cobwebs that had hung undisturbed for decades. She scrubbed the grime from the window pane cracks until the pale sunlight could finally stream through unobstructed, cutting through the stagnation of the interior. With every layer of dust she removed, she felt as though she were pulling the house out of a long, suffocating coma. She was restoring a fragile sense of dignity to an abandoned space, treating the ruined structure not as a corpse, but as a living entity that had simply been neglected by a moving world. As she worked her way deeper into the belly of the house, she began to uncover the physical detritus of the lives that had built it. In the master bedroom upstairs, tucked inside a warped dresser drawer that resisted her grip, she found a collection of faded photographs. The images were silvered and curled at the edges, depicting stoic, unsmiling faces of men in high-collared shirts and women in heavy, dark dresses. They stared out at her with eyes that had seen their own share of harsh New England winters. In the back hallway, half buried under a collapsed section of plaster, she found a pair of worn-out work boots. The leather was cracked and stiff as iron, molded permanently to the shape of feet that had spent a lifetime plowing the surrounding rocky soil. The most poignant discovery came from a small wooden crate beneath the stairs, a stack of leather-bound journals. When she carefully opened them, her heart sank slightly. The pages were heavily ruined by moisture. The ink bled into illegible, ghostly blue smudges by decades of damp air. Only a few scattered words remained clear, dates from the 1920s, references to the price of grain, and brief notes about the coming frost. She held the ruined journals in her calloused hands, sitting on the edge of a dust-covered trunk, and felt a profound, aching wave of familiarity. The narrative of her own life had been much like these pages. She, too, had been discarded by a society that valued the new, the fast, and the profitable. When the city had evicted her, it had essentially declared her life's history, her decades of hard work, her quiet sacrifices, her very existence, to be irrelevant, a footnote, to be swept away into a municipal shelter. She was a forgotten legacy, living inside a forgotten legacy. This realization did not bring her sadness. Instead, it forged a deep, spiritual kinship between her and the farmhouse. They were two kindred spirits, both weathered by time, both abandoned by those who should have cared for them, yet both still standing. The house had held its ground against the elements just as she had held her dignity against the cruelty of poverty. She looked at the peeling wallpaper and the cracked plaster not as signs of failure, but as battle scars. She understood the house, and the house seemed to understand her, providing a silent, sturdy shelter in exchange for her care. By the fifth evening, the kitchen had transformed. The iron stove, though still cold, was polished clean. The wooden table was free of grime, and her single candle sat in the center of a space that now felt cared for. The shadows that danced on the walls no longer felt menacing. They felt like old companions, welcoming her into their quiet fold. She had not just cleaned a physical space, she had reclaimed her own humanity within it. As she lay down to sleep on her makeshift bed of cleaned blankets, listening to the familiar groaning of the timber, she knew she was no longer just a visitor. She was the keeper of this house, and the house was the keeper of her. By the time January descended upon New England, the world outside the farmhouse had vanished beneath a blinding sheet of white. A fierce, predatory blizzard had locked the region in its icy grip, cutting off the long, winding gravel road and isolating her completely from the nearest town. The wind did not merely blow, it shrieked against the gables, throwing heavy drifts of snow against the boarded windows until the house felt entirely submerged. Inside, the temperature plummeted to a dangerous, numbing freeze. Survival contracted to a single room, the central parlor, where she had built a roaring fire within the deep stone hearth, using dry timber she had painstakingly hauled from the woodpile before the storm hit. She huddled near the crackling flames, wrapped tightly in 3 layers of old blankets, her calloused hands extended toward the heat. The fire cast a warm, restless orange glow across the room, throwing her elongated shadow against the ancient wallpaper. For hours, the only sounds were the violent thrumming of the wind, the occasional thud of a falling branch outside, and the familiar, comforting groans of the old timber joists flexing under the weight of the snow. She had grown accustomed to the vocabulary of the house, understanding every creak and sigh as the natural language of aging wood. But as the clock drifted past midnight and the blizzard reached its howling crescendo, an anomalous sound cut through the chaos of the storm. It was faint at first, a low frequency that felt more like a vibration against her spine than a noise in her ears. She froze, tilting her head toward the dark corner of the parlor. She waited, holding her breath, expecting it to be the frantic scurry of a field mouse or a squirrel seeking refuge from the freeze. But she had lived in old buildings long enough to know what rodents sounded like. This was entirely different. It was a distinct, rhythmic scratching, heavy, deliberate, and undeniably metallic. Scrape, click, scrape. The sound had a mechanical cadence to it, a repetitive cadence that rose and fell with a strange, haunting precision. It did not wander across the ceiling or dart down toward the floorboards. Instead, it emanated from a specific, fixed position, deep within the double-thick parlor wall, right where the heavy timber framing met the stone chimney breast. She sat perfectly still, every muscle in her 70-year-old frame tensing. In the deep isolation of the wilderness, a sound like that could easily breed paranoia, conjuring ghosts or madness born of the cold. But her mind remained sharp, anchored by a lifetime of practical survival. The scratching stopped for a long, agonizing minute, leaving only the roar of the wind. Then, as if driven by some internal winding mechanism, it began again. Scrape, click, scrape, driven by a mixture of deep curiosity and the survival instinct to investigate anything threatening her sanctuary. She pushed the blankets aside. The cold of the room hit her instantly, a stark contrast to the heat of the hearth. Standing up, her joints popping quietly in the chill, she reached down and gripped the handle of an old iron poker resting beside the fire. The metal was heavy and reassuringly solid in her hand. Using the iron poker as both a weapon and a tool, she tracked the sound, moving slowly across the creaking floorboards toward the darkest side of the parlor. The rhythmic scratching grew louder, sharper, and more resonance-filled as she approached a massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelf that was built directly into the wall alongside the stone chimney. The shelf was made of thick, dark oak, warped by time and empty save for a few layers of dust and peeling lacquer. She placed her ear against the wood of the third shelf. The vibration was undeniable. The sound wasn't coming from behind the bookshelf. It was coming from inside the hollow cavity of the wall, directly behind the built-in unit. She tapped the iron poker gently against the back panel of the bookcase. A dull, heavy thud echoed back from most sections, indicating solid timber. But when she struck the panel near the center, right at chest height, the sound changed drastically. It was a hollow, echoing ring. There was a significant, deliberate void hidden within the framing of the chimney breast. And from right behind that specific, hollow expanse of wood, the metallic scraping flared up once more, sharper and faster than before, as if her physical touch had triggered a long-dormant reaction within the structural studs of the farmhouse. The morning arrived with a blinding, absolute stillness. The blizzard had finally spent its fury, leaving behind a world buried under a thick, pristine shroud of white. Outside, pale winter sunlight struck the snowcaps, reflecting a sharp, diamond-like glare through the unboarded cracks of the parlor windows. Inside, the fire had dwindled to a bed of glowing red embers, but the temperature had stabilized. Despite the serene beauty of the dawn, her mind remained completely fixated on the hollow ring of the built-in bookshelf. The strange, rhythmic metallic scratching had ceased just before dawn, leaving an expectant, heavy silence hanging over the room. Driven by a mixture of practical necessity and an undeniable burning curiosity, she could not let the mystery rest. She knew old farmhouses. A hollow void next to a chimney breast could mean a structural collapse, a pocket of trapped moisture, or shifting masonry that could compromise the entire hearth. But deeper down, her instinct told her this was none of those things. Armed with an old, rusted claw hammer she had retrieved from her meager toolkit in the kitchen, she stood before the dark oak bookcase. She began by prying at the central backing panel of the shelf, where the wood had already warped from decades of temperature shifts. The dry oak resisted at first, groaning as the ancient iron nails fought to hold their grip, but her calloused hands applied a slow, steady leverage. With a sharp, echoing snap, the central panel splintered and gave way, exposing a jagged window into the dark cavity of the double-thick wall behind it. Instead of solid timber studs or stone masonry, she was greeted by a layer of ancient, brittle lath and thick, water-damaged plaster. She raised the hammer, using the blunt head to strike the plaster. Each blow sent a dull, heavy thud through the parlor, raining white powder and gray debris down onto her boots. She worked with a methodical, quiet intensity, chipping away at the crumbling material, widening the breach inch by inch. As the plaster shattered and fell away in large, brittle chunks, she expected to see the typical contents of a century-old wall: crumbling horsehair insulation, the nests of long-dead rodents, or perhaps wads of worthless vintage newspapers stuffed into the gaps to keep out the New England draft. Instead, as she cleared the final layer of debris, her hammer struck something solid, heavy, and distinctly yielding. She reached her arm into the darkened breach, her fingers brushing against a texture that was entirely unexpected. It wasn't rough wood or cold stone. It was smooth, stiff, and heavily waxy. Reaching deeper into the structural studs, she gripped the object and pulled. It was heavy, far heavier than its size suggested, requiring her to use both hands to maneuver it through the splintered opening. When she finally brought it into the pale winter sunlight, she found herself holding a thick, rectangular bundle, about the size of a brick, bound tightly with rotted twine. The exterior was wrapped in layers of heavy, dark green oilcloth, a material traditionally used in the early 20th century to waterproof military gear and maritime cargo. She set the heavy bundle down on the cleared kitchen table, the dust motes dancing frantically around it in the morning light. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from the biting chill of the house, but from the sheer weight of anticipation. Using the claw of her hammer, she snapped the brittle twine. It gave way with a faint hiss. With slow, deliberate movements, her calloused fingers began to unroll the stiff, wax-coated fabric. She fully expected to find decayed ledgers, old clothing, or perhaps a cache of worthless historical documents ruined by time. But as the final layer of oilcloth fell away, the pale sunlight caught the contents, and her breath caught sharply in her throat. Resting inside the waterproof wrapping was a sight that defied everything she knew about her abandoned sanctuary. It was a flawless, pristine stack of United States gold certificates from the series of 1928, their bright orange backs gleaming as vividly as the day they were printed. Each bill bore the crisp, uncirculated texture of paper that had never seen the inside of a wallet or the light of a teller's window. Beneath the currency lay a heavy, engraved gold pocket watch, its crystal glass completely intact, and a thick, leather-bound notebook embossed with a strange, intricate mechanical seal. She stared down at the table, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't just a hidden keepsake. It was a carefully guarded, untouched treasury, shielded from the dampness of the earth and the passage of time by the very walls that had sheltered her. The morning light grew sharper, turning the kitchen into a brightly illuminated stage for a history that had refused to die. She did not return to the parlor. Instead, she stood frozen over the wooden table, her hands hovering just inches above the unrolled oilcloth bundle. The sheer physical presence of the cash felt heavy, almost holy, occupying the quiet space with an energy that changed the farmhouse instantly. What she had discovered was not just an old stash of cash. It was a meticulously preserved vault from a vanished era. With careful, reverent movements, her calloused fingers began to sort through the contents. Beneath the initial stack of orange-backed 1928 gold certificates lay even more staggering wealth. She pulled out crisp, high-denomination notes, bills bearing the stoic faces of long-dead presidents, marked with face values of $500 and $1,000. In the margins, the words, "In gold coin payable to the bearer on demand," stood out in sharp, elegant typography. Next to the currency sat a bundle of mint-condition historical bonds, issued by the federal government and private railroad syndicates during the Roaring Twenties, complete with their original, unclipped Divotine coupons still attached. The paper was thick, crackling softly under her touch, free from any of the water damage or mold that had claimed the journals she had found earlier under the stairs. But the true heart of the cash lay beneath the financial wealth. Tucked at the bottom of the oilcloth wrapping was a secondary portfolio made of heavy, treated canvas. When she untied its leather thongs, she uncovered a collection of masterfully preserved, undocumented blueprints, and technical journals. The pages were filled with incredibly dense, hand-drawn schematics of complex mechanical gears, electrical relays, and early turbine designs. They were signed in a sharp, elegant cursive that matched the name of the eccentric distant relative who had built the farmhouse, a man who, according to family lore, had been a brilliant but fiercely reclusive pioneering inventor. These documents were not just records, they were a treasure trove of lost industrial innovation, completely unknown to modern history. She leaned heavily against the edge of the kitchen table, her mind racing as the pieces of the puzzle began to lock into place. The chronological markers of the cache were precise, all pointing directly to the late autumn of 1929. She realized with sudden clarity that this wealth had not been casually misplaced. It had been intentionally, desperately hidden. This was a fortress built against ruin. The inventor had pulled his entire fortune out of the banking system just as the Wall Street market collapsed, converting his assets into gold certificates, federal bonds, and his most prized intellectual property, sealing them deep within the double-thick parlor walls to protect them from the catastrophic bank failures of the Great Depression. Then came the true tragedy of the legacy, the conflict that made her throat tighten with a bittersweet ache. The inventor had hidden the vault so well, and had been so fiercely paranoid, that he had kept the secret entirely to himself. When he died suddenly years later, and his immediate offspring became estranged and scattered across the country, the lineage fractured. The knowledge of the wealth vanished with him, leaving the subsequent generations to fall into poverty, utterly unaware that a fortune capable of altering their destinies was quietly resting inside the plaster of their ancestral home. It had sat in the dark for nearly a century while his descendants, including herself, struggled through lifetimes of quiet hardships, evictions, and systemic neglect. The irony was profound, almost cruel, yet it cemented the deep spiritual kinship she felt with the structure. The house had held its breath, guarding this immense secret through decades of abandonment, waiting for the one person who would care enough to look past its ruined exterior. It had rejected the county tax collectors and survived the elements, preserving its core until she arrived with her last $5 bill. She looked down at her calloused hands, hands that had scrubbed floors and carried bags in municipal shelters just days ago, and realized her life had shifted on its axis. She was no longer just a homeless woman seeking a temporary roof. She had become the rightful guardian of a monumental, forgotten American legacy. The transition from the absolute silence of the New England wilderness to the aggressive, glass and steel landscape of downtown Boston was jarring. She made the journey back to the city on a clear winter morning, sitting quietly on a regional train with the heavy canvas bag resting firmly against her knees. She did not look like a woman who had just altered her destiny. She wore the same faded winter coat, her worn leather boots still bearing faint traces of white plaster dust. Her destinations were no longer the crowded municipal shelters or the sterile legal aid offices, but the upper tiers of the city's historical district. She walked into the high-end, heavily secured appraisal offices of a renowned historical foundation without an appointment. The lobby was a masterclass in quiet wealth, featuring polished mahogany panels, deep plush carpets, and low, ambient lighting that made her feel instantly conspicuous. Behind a massive marble desk sat a receptionist who looked up with an expression of polite but immediate dismissal. When she requested a meeting with the head archivist, the hesitation in the room was palpable. He emerged from the secure back offices a few minutes later, clearly expecting a brief, delicate confrontation with an eccentric wanderer. He was a man of precise tailoring and sharp academic credentials, his eyes sweeping over her weathered face, her calloused hands, and her plain canvas bag with undeniable skepticism. In his profession, people frequently arrived with worthless family trinkets or counterfeit documents, convinced they had struck gold. He offered a tight, formal smile, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, and led her into a private, secure consultation room, assuming he would be ushering her back out to the street within 5 minutes. He sat across from her at a wide examination table topped with black velvet, his posture stiff, his hands clasped as he asked how he could help her. She did not offer a long, defensive explanation, nor did she betray any nervousness. Instead, her movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out the dark green, wax-coated oilcloth bundle, setting it carefully onto the black velvet. The archivist watched with an raised eyebrow as she snapped the twine and began to unroll the stiff fabric. The skepticism in the room vanished the exact moment the pale office light caught the contents of the bundle. With a soft, reverent motion, she laid out the first stack of the 1928 United States gold certificates. The archivist's breath caught sharply in his throat. He leaned forward so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He didn't speak. He reached for a pair of white cotton examination gloves from a side drawer, his hands suddenly trembling with an intensity he couldn't hide. He picked up a $1,000 note, holding it to the light, his eyes scanning the crisp, uncirculated texture, the vibrant orange backing, and the flawless alignment of the treasury seals. These weren't just rare, they were museum-grade anomalies, preserved in a condition that shouldn't exist outside of a federal vault. But the true revelation occurred when she pulled the secondary portfolio from her bag and laid out the inventor's technical journals and blueprints. As he turned the pages, using a magnifying loupe to study the dense, elegant schematics and the intricate mechanical seals, his professional detachment completely crumbled into absolute awe. His eyes darted across the hand-drawn engineering layouts of early electrical relays and revolutionary turbine designs. He recognized the signature instantly, a name that modern historians had long categorized as a brilliant but missing link in the early 20th century American Industrial Revolution. He looked up at her, his face pale, his skepticism replaced by a profound, almost reverent respect. He explained that these journals were not merely valuable, they were a monumental missing chapter of technological history. For nearly a century, scholars had assumed these specific designs had been destroyed or lost forever, leaving a massive gap in the understanding of early American innovation. To hold them in his hands, completely preserved from the dampness of time, was the equivalent of unearthing a modern artifact of legend. He leaned back, taking off his glasses to rub his eyes, completely overwhelmed by the gravity of what she had brought into his office. When he spoke again, his voice was a low, intense whisper. He estimated that between the uncirculated gold certificates, the mint-condition historical bonds with their intact coupons, and the immense intellectual property value of the undocumented blueprints, the collection was easily worth several $1,000,000 at auction. He looked at the elderly woman sitting across from him, realizing that the house she had bought for a $5 bill had just handed her a fortune that would echo through generations. She sat perfectly still, her face composed, a quiet guardian who had finally brought the forgotten legacy back into the light. Spring arrived in rural New England, not with a sudden burst, but with a gentle, systematic thawing of the earth. The stubborn snow drifted away into the soil, replaced by the vibrant, pale green of new grass and the sweet, crisp scent of blooming wild apple trees. Along the winding gravel road, the farmhouse no longer stood as a derelict monument to decay. The property was alive with the rhythmic, industrious sounds of restoration, the sharp strike of hammers, the buzz of saws, and the murmurs of specialized craftsmen who worked with a deep respect for historical preservation. Under her careful watch, the sagging porches were straightened, the rotting timber replaced with seasoned oak, and the choking blanket of ivy carefully pruned to reveal the beautiful, original 19th century woodwork beneath. With her newfound millions, she did not flee the countryside to purchase a sterile, luxury high-rise penthouse in Boston or New York. The city, with its blinding neon indifference and crowded municipal shelters, had nothing left to offer her. Instead, she chose to anchor her fortune to the very soil that had given her a second chance. She used a portion of her wealth to permanently secure the deed, clear all historic liens, and establish the estate as a private historical foundation. The main parlor, where she had once huddled for warmth by a dying fire, was meticulously transformed into a secure, climate-controlled archive. There, under museum-grade glass, the inventor's pristine gold certificates, the mint-condition bonds, and the revolutionary technical blueprints were displayed, preserved forever as a missing chapter of American industrial history. The rest of the farmhouse remained a home, her home. She kept the kitchen exactly as it had been during that first freezing week, the sturdy wooden table polished to a deep, rich sheen, a reminder of the night she had unrolled the oilcloth bundle with shaking hands. She hired the young pro bono legal aid representative who had first found her in the shelter to manage the foundation's legal affairs, ensuring that the property would remain protected long after she was gone. The house was no longer a secret rotting in the woods. It had become a living museum, a sanctuary for a legacy that had almost been erased by time. On a warm, golden afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent behind the rolling hills, the workmen gathered their tools and departed, leaving the property wrapped in a serene, profound silence. She stepped out onto the newly restored front porch, her movements fluid and unhurried. At over 70 years old, her shoulders were no longer bent by the heavy, suffocating weight of uncertainty. Her face, though still mapped with the deep lines of a lifetime of hardships, bore an expression of absolute, unshakable peace. Her calloused hands rested lightly on the smooth, freshly painted white railing of the porch. She looked out over the expansive, sun-drenched land, watching the shadows of the maple trees stretch lazily across the lawn. The air was warm, carrying the faint, nostalgic scent of cedar and old paper from the open front door behind her. She was no longer a woman displaced by time, a nameless statistic drifting through a system that had deemed her irrelevant. She had held her ground against the winter, dug through the crumbling plaster of the past, and uncovered a treasure that saved both her and the memory of the man who built this sanctuary. By unearthing and honoring a forgotten legacy, she had successfully anchored her own life, turning a $5 ruin into an eternal home.